For decades, a small group of multinational media corporations have spoon-fed the masses their news and information. However, over the last few years, the world has seen a rise of a new narrative, one that truly challenges the dominant far-left globalist establishment. This new paradigm of truth-telling and truth-seeking is a direct threat to their dominance because, let's not deny it, they are pathological liars who profit from dishonesty. It's not just the media either, it's politicians, academia, and anyone who needs to tell untruths and parasite off the general population in order to gain and retain wealth and power. Indeed, the entire establishment needs the public to remain ignorant in order to keep their positions of privilege. The truth will set you free, and if overnight every one of us simply refused to accept the lies or allow further establishment bullying, then the world would suddenly be a very different place. It is now more important than it has ever been to speak freely and refuse to self-censor. Yet, over the past week or so, our ability to speak our minds without censorship or interference has come under direct attack from the ruling establishment. In the wake of the Christchurch incident, instead of calling for peace and dialogue with respect for differing opinions no matter how wrong or offensive, the establishment has demanded more censorship and more speech suppression. The New Zealand government under Jacinda Ardern even went so far as to make it illegal to hold a copy of Brenton Tarrant's manifesto. You can still buy a copy of Mein Kampf, mind you. As John F. Kennedy famously stated, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable, and while the former is infinitely preferable, the establishment seem hell-bent on ensuring the latter. Before we continue, for some amazing karma, please check out Subscribestar, where for as little as $5 a month you can support my work and help save Western civilization. Brenton Tarrant clearly stated that one of his primary goals was to create polarization and divide the West. He wants to, and I quote, add momentum to the pendulum swings of history, further destabilizing and polarizing Western societies, end quote. He fully expects and wants the ruling establishment to overextend their hand and to experience the inevitable backlash. A backlash that was already peacefully growing despite the best efforts of those in charge. The establishment had a clear choice in the wake of the Christchurch incident. They could call for calm and reasonable discussion, or they could get hysterical and call for the silencing of dissent. Would they take stock of what happened and work through our problems rationally, or would they give the shooter exactly what he wanted? Unfortunately, as everyone who's been paying attention to world events over the last few years would have predicted, they chose the latter. Within a few days, the far-left Communist Party, who delightfully call themselves the Greens, launched a campaign to end what they call hate speech. Here's lead communist Richard Di Natale speaking with Tom Elliott on 3AW.
And we're seeing this sort of rise in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, in racism right around, not just Australia, but around the world. There's this sort of white supremacist and neo-Nazi movement that's taking a foothold. So our plan is to basically tackle it from a number of perspectives. One is we want politicians to start actually showing a bit of respect, and so we've long discussed having a code of conduct in the federal parliament. Most workplaces have got them, so we're going to introduce a federal parliamentary code of conduct, and we're calling on both parties to support it. We want to make sure that the funding, when it comes to tackling violent extremism, works in a way that works with community level programs, is based on good research. So we've got some investment in research there, and really importantly, community level programs, a range of very successful community level programs to make sure that there's an investment in that. National anti-racism campaign. We used to have, education campaigns against racism on people. So funding a national anti-racism campaign, the Human Rights Commission make it really clear that this is one of the most effective ways of dealing with the problem of racism.
In other words, he wants to force politicians to speak and behave the way he wants them to indoctrinate children into thinking the way he wants them to, and most of all, he wants taxpayers to fund it. He uses the anti-white racial slurs of racism, racist, and white supremacist, while openly stating he wants to create taxpayer-funded propaganda to stop what he deems wrongthink. But it gets worse. Tom Elliott challenges Di Natale to define hate speech, and this is the answer that he gets.
But someone will have to define it, Senator. That's the thing. If you want to outlaw it, you've got to somebody.
No, I'm with you, Tom.
Yeah.
Of course you do, and that's why you have a thorough legal inquiry process to do it. You don't want it to be done on the fly. You need to make sure we've got the legislative tools to do that.
This is just like the classic scene in Yes Minister, where two members of the political class are sitting around discussing an inquiry. The first man asks the second man if he knows the answer to it yet. The second man says no, and the first man is shocked and dismayed that the other doesn't. He can't believe anyone would start an inquiry without first knowing the answer to it. Richard Di Natale knows it's political opinion he actually wants to silence. He already said he wants to indoctrinate children and the wider community. He's just not willing to state his desire for political censorship outright because he's dishonest, and if he were open about his true intentions, he knows it would look bad. This is why the term hate speech even exists in the first place. Censorship just doesn't ring well with the electorate, and the left want to think they are the good guys no matter how blatantly they attack our liberties and rights. Di Natale wasn't the only politician pushing an anti-free speech narrative either. Opposition leader Bill Shorten couldn't miss a chance to virtue signal.
Let me be clear, not all right-wing extremist hate speech ends in violence, but all right-wing extremist violence started in hate speech.
This is the so-called man who's likely to be our next Prime Minister, and he's directly assaulting the founding principle of Western civilization, freedom of speech. He's using a tragedy to attack those he disagrees with and win political points with a potential voting bloc. This is also a blatantly obvious false cause fallacy. The idea that saying mean words somehow leads to acts of violence is nonsense. Sure, nobody wants direct incitement to be legal, nor should we allow defamation or other dishonesty, but the idea that a mythical and ill-defined concept known as hate speech could cause anyone to act violently is just ridiculous. On that note, there is actually something that does cause people to act violently. Stay tuned to the end of the video to find out what that is. It's not just high-ranking party politicians getting in on the act either. Queensland's Anti-Discrimination Commissar Scott McDougall wants to examine Australia's constitutional protection of political speech. He said, and I quote, "The idea that anyone can go online and publish words that have real consequences for other people and not bear any responsibility for that, those days just have to end. Similarly, politicians need to be held to account for their use of language and whether they are licensing members of the community to engage in hate speech. It may be that the implied freedom of political communication needs to be revisited to draw a line around what freedom society ought to tolerate. What is the price that we are prepared to accept for allowing unchecked free speech?" End quote. Isn't it funny that he doesn't seem to care about the consequences of his words? He's not worried at all what might result from this direct attack on our most fundamental right. Mr. McDougall asked the question, what price are we prepared to accept for allowing unchecked free speech? The answer to that question is the same answer ANZAC gave, and it's the same answer countless millions of European men have given over the centuries. That price is our lives and eternal vigilance. Anything less is an insult to their sacrifice. The Grand Mufti of Australia decided to give his opinion on the matter too. From the SBS, and I quote, The Grand Mufti of Australia, Ibrahim Abu Muhammad, has called on Prime Minister Scott Morrison to push for new laws to greater protect Muslims against Islamophobia. He noted that such laws would be similar to those in place in numerous countries which protect Jews against anti-Semitic speech. Section 18C of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act prohibits actions including what is widely called hate speech that offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person or group of people based on their race. However, comments directed towards Muslims are said towards people who adhere to the Islamic faith, not at a racial group." End quote. The first ANZACs would be rolling in their grave. Not just because we have a Grand Mufti in the first place. They'd be rolling in their graves because he gets to demand the PM take the freedom of speech of all Australians to criticise Islam, again insulting their sacrifice. The Grand Mufti wants to make it illegal to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate someone because of their religious affiliation. Remember, it's considered highly offensive to Muslims to draw a picture of Muhammad or even to criticise their religion at all. What the Grand Mufti is actually proposing is nothing short of making blasphemy illegal. It is the antithesis of Western culture. If people don't like freedom of speech in the West, then nothing is forcing them to stay in the West. These are by no means the only examples of the ruling class pushing to silence anyone critical of the current leftist paradigm in the wake of Christchurch. Since the event, they've gone all out, trying to demonise and attack anyone who dares speak their mind and tell the truth in this time of universal deceit. The far-left taxpayer-funded propaganda centre known as the ABC even shamefully tried to connect Tarrant with Blair Cottrell, claiming that years ago Tarrant commented on one of Cottrell's pages. They provided no screenshots or actual evidence. They said, "Take our word for it," and you are expected to just trust them. The idea that Tarrant commenting on a UPF page means anything at all meaningful is again absolutely ridiculous. They hilariously provide a statement from a well-known US-based anti-white hate group too, famous for both denying white replacement and keeping track of the process of white replacement at the same time. It's as worrying as it is pure evil, but it gets much worse than that. As mentioned earlier, we do know something for a fact that does lead to more violence, an outcome that no reasonable person wants. That something is censorship. There is extensive evidence showing that suppression of free speech leads to physical conflict. This is from the University of Oslo's Centre for Research on Extremism, and I quote, "This analysis arrived at 2 causal recipes, each containing 3 causal conditions, the combination of which appears to fuel hostility, polarisation and violence. First, there is a Northern European recipe that involves the combination of high immigration, low electoral support for anti-immigration, radical right parties, and extensive public repression of radical right actors and opinions. Second, there is a South European recipe that involves the combination of socio-economic hardship, authoritarian legacies, and extensive left-wing terrorism and militancy." End quote. And there will be a link to all sources in the description. What this study clearly shows is that suppression of speech and ostracism of nationalist voices, along with poor economic outcomes for ordinary people, is what causes white ethnic terrorism. This is a demonstrable fact, and it should be obvious to anyone who understands human nature and history. That means if we are to have peace, and this is what all sane people want, it is now imperative that the ruling class allow more discussion, not less. Rather than continuing to ostracize nationalist voices, they need to bring them to the table and let people make their own minds up as to the merits of the arguments presented. YouTuber Apostate Prophet absolutely nails this point in his video regarding the Christchurch incident.
If we shut discussions down and label any kind of normal speech as hate speech and Islamophobia, or sensitive and therefore not allowed, if we are going to vilify and censor and silence each other, we will leave the discourse to people who won't find any meaning in talking and who will become violent and kill people. Because they think that a change that couldn't be made through political and diplomatic means, by exchanging opinions, no matter how controversial they are, could somehow be made by massacre and fear. If it comes to that, we will always kill and destroy the possibilities of talking about things and maybe even convincing each other. We should never let it come to that. That's why we need to be able to talk to each other and stop violence. Really stop violence and extremism wherever it occurs. Because no matter from what mind and from what side it comes, shedding blood, spreading fear, destroying lives will never bring anything better than what we are afraid of.
Very well said. You can change minds through words or through swords. I choose words. What do you choose? Thanks for watching. Share the truth around, and I'll see ya when I see ya.